Years ago, there was an old radio program on WOR in New York called The Garden Hotline, hosted by a horticultural expert, the late Ralph Snodsmith. He always started his show with that John Denver music you were listening to. And I listened to that show every Sunday morning as Ralph fielded gardening questions from listeners, all kinds of questions like, can coffee and tea grounds help acidify my soil? The answer, not to any marked degree. Can seedlings thin from a row of lettuce be used as transplants? Answer, if you're careful with their tiny roots, yes. Question, is it better to plant my tomatoes on a sunny or a cloudy day? Maybe you were wondering about that too. The answer he gave was cloudy, since reduced light exposure reduces transpiration. That's the leaves giving off all that water that comes up through the roots. As a backyard gardener myself, I still have lots of questions, and I know so do many of you. So we're recreating that garden hotline, hopefully giving you some science behind the gardening tips. We've collected your sciency gardening questions, and we've asked two expert guests to answer them. Let me introduce them. Elizabeth Buck, fresh market vegetable production specialist with Cornell Cooperative Extension, which is in Ithaca, New York, and Gary Pilarchik, author of The Modern Homestead Garden and host of the Rusted Garden YouTube channel. He lives in Howard County, Maryland. Thank you both for taking time to be with us today.
Thanks for having me.
It's great to be here. Thank you.
Thanks to have both of you. And just a note to those listening, we're recording this segment in front of a live Zoom audience. And if you'd like to be in our next Zoom audience, you can find out more about attending future segments. That's up on our website at sciencefriday.com/live stream. All right, let's get right into the questions. Gary, let me first say that I really enjoy your Rusted Garden videos on YouTube, and I've learned a lot. So let's get right into some of these questions that maybe you can answer for us.
Sure.
First question submitted via the SciFri VoxPop app. This is one from Dan in Yorkville, New York. And Dan says, I really like to hear about some nice non-lethal means of keeping squirrels and rabbits and whatnot from getting to tomatoes and things like that. Also, I'd like to know if there's some non-lethal, non-toxic way of keeping insects out of the garden as well. And I've got to say that those critters are in my garden at the same time, so I'm glad we started out with that question. What do you say, Gary?
Well, you try reasoning and they just won't stay on one plant. So they do become a nuisance and they will take everything down. Non-lethal way, I have so many squirrels where I'm at on my 2 acres. I had to do trap and release and move them 5 miles away. Some people may not want to do that, but it can be done. You have to move them away. The other thing is, because squirrels are such great climbers, even if you use a fence or you create something high, they will just climb over it. Fences are great for groundhogs and other things like that. But it's really, really a challenge with, even birds, small animals and such. There are sprays you can put out, but they tend not to work for squirrels, and a good rain comes, it washes them away. So it's really, really difficult.
Yeah, nature is going to win. If
they will win. You can try planting stuff away from your garden. Maybe they'll eat that and get their fill and not come over to your garden, but it's really, really difficult. And then non-lethal ways for insects and maybe like diseases and stuff like that, at least for insects, any kind of organic dust or insect dust that you use, even though it's organic and safer for you and me, it's going to kill good and bad insects. So you have to be aware of that too. So it's really hard not to harm your pollinators or your bees.
Okay, that was a great answer to that question. Let me move on and go to another question. Lots of questions are coming in. Elizabeth, let's talk about pollinators. It's really important to get pollinators into your garden, isn't it?
Yes, absolutely. And it's more important for some crops than other crops because plants are really, I love plants. There's so many cool things about them. One of the cool things is that a lot of plants are self-pollinating. And those are things that tend to have closed flowers. So your tomatoes, for example, they tend to pollinate themselves. So pollinators are good for all of your plants. Not all of them need them. So if you're not seeing a lot of bees on your tomatoes, no worries, that's fine. I think the coolest thing about pollinators is that it's not just bees. And there are native bees, there's flies, there's insects, all sorts of critters are out there doing the work of pollination. So it's really this great biodiverse system out in your garden.
And I know, Gary, that some people choose to grow their veggies in a container. I've seen on your YouTube you showing us how to do that. Will that keep some of these pests away if you can grow them in a container?
I wish that I could say yes, it does that. If each gardening zone is very unique, so whatever pests you have or whatever critters you have, they can find their way into containers and stuff like that. If you have a really big problem, one container I have, it's just a big fire ring that you would buy. I'm growing a Brussels sprout in there, and I've set up a couple arches and put ag fabric over it, and it zips shut. That is a way to keep out squirrels, birds, and stuff like that. But you have to make a decision on, do you want these big ag fabric tents everywhere? But it is a challenge.
Mm-hmm. Let's go to Ryan, who has a question about their garden onions. Ryan, you're growing onions. Go ahead.
Yeah. Can you guys hear me all right?
Yes, go ahead.
All right. Yeah. So I grew some onions that I got from the garden store, the little shoot starts, not the bulbs. And I thought they would not go to seed, but they did go to seed. And I didn't know if that was because we had a cold period after I planted them. So maybe they thought they went through a winter. So I was just A, looking for an explanation on that, and B, wondering if I could gather the seeds from them and to plant for next year, and how I'd go about doing that. They developed the seed head and they just started opening up.
Gary, what do you say to help out Ryan there?
Yes, you can collect the seeds and you can use them. And sometimes onions do better if the seeds are put in directly. And you kind of answered the question. Onions are biennials. So even if they're small and they bulb and they think they're on their second year of growth, sometimes they more quickly go to flower. It could have been that cold period, could be sometimes, and I'm not 100% sure, but you got short day, midday, long day onions. Sometimes that can impact them too, based on where you're growing. And when we buy those onion bunches, we don't always know what exactly those onion varieties are, except they're yellow, white, or red. There's not a lot of information there.
Okay, let's go to Elizabeth. A question for you from Ariel from Pittsburgh. It seems like plants choose between lush leaves and abundant fruits. Some of my best performing tomato and pumpkin plants are a bit spindly, while those that are super green and lush have lower yields. Why is that? And how do I get them to make more fruit and less leaves? Any ideas? Elizabeth.
Yeah, that's a great question, Ariel. And it all comes back to how the plant balances energy within itself. So plants will do a lot of vegetative growth, and that's the big green happy leaves, or they do reproductive growth. And because they're vegetables, they're relatively short-lived plants. Once they make that switch to reproductive, to fruiting, they don't easily want to go back and push a lot of that green tissue out. So that's what the plant naturally wants to do. It wants to progress, grow a bunch of leaves, flowers, start making fruits, and keep making fruits. Sometimes we can love our plants a little bit too much. And if we over fertilize them, particularly if we give them too much nitrogen, the plant responds to that nitrogen by growing a lot of leaves. And life is good and life is easy, and it grows a lot of leaves and doesn't get to fruiting. The other thing that can happen is that when plants are really stressed, it pushes them towards fruiting more because they're a little bit worried they're not going to make it through, kind of adding emotions to the plants. But who doesn't love plants here? So in that case, when your plants are a little bit spindly, sometimes they're going to produce more because they're kind of worried. So you can balance things out in your garden and get a good sized plant that still puts out a lot of fruit by adjusting the amount of nitrogen and potassium that you feed your plant. Because most vegetables, when they're putting out fruit, they need less nitrogen and more potassium. So you want to kind of change how you feed your plant.
Gary, what kind of fertilizer do you feed your plants?
So I focus on two things. If I'm doing a granular fertilizer, any organic granular fertilizer around the 5.55 NP and K, that's pretty balanced. Up or down a few numbers is fine. That's a slow release, which means when you mix that into your soil, takes some time for the microbiology to break it down, and it slowly feeds your plant, say over a couple of months. Then you have your water soluble fertilizer. What I use for that is fish emulsion. It's a 5-1-1 NP and K, more the nitrogen, as Elizabeth was saying, that helps that green growth get started. And being water soluble, it means it's immediately available to your plant. It can use it right away. So in combination, it's good to have your organic granular, your water soluble. But in addition to that, I put my beds to rest in the fall with compost, with leaves. I even put wood ash on them, even alfalfa pellets, to just kind of put organic matter in there. And I do the same thing again in the spring.
And I think you got a really strong point there, Gary, where you say it takes time for the organic fertilizers to break down. That's, I think, where it's hard for people to gauge how long. And so it's good to think of your garden in terms of what's the slow release fertilizer and what's my quick release fertilizer. And if you can do that, then you can set yourself up for a lot of success.
All right, let's go back to our audience. Mary. Mary has a question about basil. Oh, I love my basil. I'm waiting to hear what Mary has to say. Mary, go ahead.
Well, I am a basil failure. I have planted probably, I don't know how many seed packets of basil. And last year I went through 3 of them before it finally dawned on me. They may like it really hot, like zinnias have to have really hot, sustained weather to germinate. So this year I waited until it was just murderously hot, and I planted multiple times, and I haven't seen a single seedling, not once here, but I planted some at my brother-in-law's home, and that came right up. I mean, I don't get what the difference is.
Elizabeth, you're nodding your head in agreement here.
Yeah, can I ask you a couple questions? So are you planting it into a container or right out into the soil?
Mary?
Soil, in soil.
Okay. So basil, you're right. Basil does want to germinate under warmer conditions, and it's a little tough sometimes when you do it right in the soil. Lots of times there's better success in starting the basil inside in a small pot and then transplanting it outside. And that's because basil gets, it damps off. There are a couple of diseases that will take out the seedling just as it's germinating. And so it's sometimes more successful to just take that element of uncertainty out of the picture, start inside, and that way you can control the moisture levels too. Basil doesn't really like heavy clay soils. So if you've got a heavier soil and your brother, your neighbor, whomever has this lighter soil, they're going to be a little bit more successful getting it to germinate directly in the ground.
Gary, any hints from you?
Yeah, I agree with that. So getting a basic potting mix or a starting mix and just like a little yogurt container. And when it's warm, the basil's looking for warm soil, warm ambient temperature. If you plant it up in a little container and you keep it outside, just let the top dry. That's when you know to water again, but let that top dry, and that helps with that damping off kind of disease that comes along. And I can look over there, I have 12 basil plants potted up for a future video, and that's how I start all of mine. And they do transfer nicely into the garden that way.
How do you know when it's better to go to the garden store and buy a little basil plant rather than starting from seed? And I guess generally for all of your plants, Gary.
So I have a thing against buying plants from the big box stores. Go to your local nurseries, know the people that are growing the plants. Sometimes you can buy basil that's been sitting, it's not been watered, it struggles, it's getting tall, it doesn't look great. It looks great, but it's a little bit past its prime. By the time you get it to your garden, it wants to go and flower really quickly. So I do recommend either getting really small transplants from your local nursery and getting them into your soil, or going by seed. Just be careful that you're not buying plants that have been totally stressed at your local big box stores, because it damages the plant. And like Elizabeth was saying, sometimes when you're stressed, then you go right to fruit production trying to reproduce, and you just have a hard time getting them going.
Let's go to another Zoom call. Carol has a question about her compost pile. Carol, tell us a question. What's your question? Oh, well, here comes her question. Carol is a gardener. A gardener in our family puts a lot of coffee grounds, bags and bags from a coffee chain, into the compost pile. How much is too much? Elizabeth, can you feel that one?
Sure. So when you're mixing compost, you want to balance everything out. And so you have to think about what are the characteristics of what I'm putting in. So if you're putting in a lot of coffee grounds, that's going to be a acidic material. It's going to be a fine textured material, and it's going to be a material that's maybe not the fastest to break down compared to some other things. So it becomes more of a question of volume. Can I balance out this volume of coffee grounds with an equal volume of something that's going to be very complementary to it? And really, I think that's more a question of how much space do you have in your composting area.
And that question I started off with about coffee grounds. Do coffee grounds acidify? They sort of acidic by nature. Do they acidify the soil? Can you plant them or spread them on the ground to make it more acid, Gary?
I think the answer is, in theory, it sounds good, but you would need a lot of it. So what you'd be putting down, if you're just sprinkling grounds down anyway, they need to break down by the soil microbiology, and sometimes that kind of moderates things a little bit. If you needed something to quickly change the pH of your soil, you're better off using, something else. I wouldn't mix a lot of coffee grounds into your container mixes, but you would have to use a lot.
And while I have you here, and I watched your video on this, because this is the first year that I am planting potatoes. I mean, I've tried the potatoes in my 5-gallon bucket. I've got one in one of these cloth buckets, and they've been growing terrific. They grow giant stalks, and then they have flowers, gorgeous flowers. Who knew that potatoes had such gorgeous flowers on the top? How do I know when to dig them up, Gary?
So after they've been growing about 70 days, there's probably potatoes in there. You can kind of, dig around and pull some out if you want to. But you really know, you really know when to harvest them. When the greenery starts looking yellow, you're going to think it's sickly. You're going to start to worry. You might want to start feeding it more. That's just the natural end to the potato. So when it starts to yellow, turns brown, dies off, you can let them sit in there a week or so, and then you can harvest your potatoes that way. That's the sign you're ready to go. And when you do harvest them, a lot of people don't know that you can plant potatoes again, especially the early 70, 90-day potatoes. So when you're harvesting, start some more. And you can take them really through the summer. Sometimes it gets too hot, but I recommend people keep a journal. I always say, try it, experiment, take notes. If it doesn't work, doesn't work. But you can continue potatoes all the way into the frost period in your area.
Well, but speaking of hot, Elizabeth, we've had a lot of questions about the heat this summer, and 90s, hundreds, triple digits. What's the best thing you should do to protect your garden from all of this heat?
That's a great question, and we're going to continue to see more heat as we move forward in time. Plants are built in to cool themselves, and the way that works in the plant is it draws water up through the roots and lets it out through the leaves, like it's evapotranspiration. And it gives us a really good way to check on how our plants are doing. If you walk up to your plant and you grab a leaf in the middle, not one right up on the top where it's in the sun, but one in the middle, that leaf should feel cool to the touch. And that means the plant is happy and it's got enough water moving through it to keep itself cool. Because they have this built-in mechanism, it really comes down to, can I give my plant enough water? And that can be really tough in areas that are going through a drought also. And I know a lot of the country, especially out west, is in that very scenario, extremely hot, extremely dry. Maybe you can't water your plants enough. So the other thing you can do is kind of redesign your garden and say, all right, maybe this plant doesn't need to be in the sun for 10 hours a day. Maybe it only needs to be in the sun for 6 hours a day to grow properly. And by taking it out of the sun, those extra hours, planting in a different place, reducing the amount of stress and the amount of water it's going to consume, which lets it cool itself better.
Great answer. That's something we all can use, that advice. Let's move on to a Twitter question. Sylvia Wright from California asks us, what's the truth about blossom end rot in tomatoes? Let me begin with that, Gary. How do you stop that?
So the truth, she's probably talking about, you hear two things. There's not enough calcium, add calcium, or it's just a watering issue. And it's really kind of a combination of both. If you're not watering your tomato plant properly, the roots can be affected and you may have calcium present and it can't pull that calcium into the plant system. So it's not really a calcium issue. However, if you put some like calcium nitrate, some calcium that can be pulled in through the leaves or more easily absorbed, that can help out the problem. The best thing to do is just, have some lime in your soil, know that the calcium's there, and stick with that consistent watering. This happens a lot more, I think, with Roma type tomatoes and with containers. If a container, because of the heat that we're talking about, you may have to water a container plant twice in a day. When the tomato plant is mature, it will pull that water out so quickly. If it completely dries through, that's often when you start seeing blossom end rot because you have a problem with the root system. So moisture, keeping it consistent, mulching out in the garden, and knowing that you have calcium present. You don't need a lot of calcium. I think it's a 7th or 2nd level macronutrient or something like that. But watering, I think, is the bigger issue.
Elizabeth, what does blossom end rot look like for people who don't know what we're talking about?
Absolutely. So blossom end rot is on the bottom of the tomato. And the reason it's on the bottom of the tomato is, remember those straws that pull the water through? Well, the bottom of the tomato doesn't have very many of those straws. And if it doesn't have a lot of straws, it can't pull water. Since calcium moves with the water in plant, no water goes to the bottom tomato, no calcium goes to the bottom of the tomato. And the cells at the bottom of the tomato, they can't expand. Calcium is really important in allowing plant cells to grow and divide and get bigger. And when they can't expand, they die. So what ends up happening is you get this brown or dark gray dead spot on the bottom of the tomato, and it starts out as a firm rot. Sometimes a secondary rot will come in and make it soft, but it's a firm, dry, brown or dark colored rot at the bottom of the fruit. And it's really characteristic. And the important thing to know about blossom end rot is exactly what Gary was saying. It's about making sure that your watering is consistent. And the second thing to know about diagnosing it is the problem that you see probably happened 2 to 3 weeks ago, that the plant was deficient in water and or calcium.
Wow,
Yeah,
great
that's
advice.
that's a good point too, because people say, can I save my tomato that's brown on the bottom? You can, if it ripens, you can actually cut it off, but those are pretty much goners. But you can start watering consistently and getting it back in shape, and then the future tomatoes will do okay.
Okay, great advice so far. Let's go on to the next question on Facebook. Scott Kloss wants to know, why is my cantaloupe not growing? I planted them as starts at the same time as my zucchini when they were the same size. Now my zucchini are much bigger, Elizabeth. What advice do you have?
So this is a lot of back and forth troubleshooting, and sometimes it's not easy to do this. There are resources for home gardeners to use and great books. There's a number of books. What's Wrong with My Vegetable Garden is a good one. And the reason I'm saying that is because without being able to ask a question live, I can't really answer it, but I can take some guesses. And the first guess is that these are plants that are in the same family, so they oftentimes have very similar needs. So that means that it wasn't planted at the wrong time, or it's not getting too much or too little water compared to the one next door, the zucchini. So in those situations, I am oftentimes wondering, was the cantaloupe maybe struggling with something when it went into the ground? Was that transplant maybe having a little bit of root rot before it was ever put in the ground? And that's something that can come from a greenhouse center. It's really common, but it's good to know and be able to check out your plants ahead of time, because then you end up in situations where you get a big zucchini and a sad cantaloupe.
Anything to add, Gary, to that?
I agree with that, because that goes to, sometimes you'll buy the cantaloupe and maybe it dried out or it wasn't treated well. The zucchini was fine, or you're growing it, you put it in the ground, and for whatever reason, you're not sure what's going on. I mean, some things that you can do with that cantaloupe is you can give it that fish emulsion, and you can try and give it more nitrogen, and you should see it start to green up over 3 to 5 days. You can do it again and just see if you can save the plant. If you've given it, a couple of weeks, it doesn't look good, that's when I recommend replanting new seeds, or maybe start some backup plants when you notice it's struggling, so that when you decide to pull that out, you can put in a new cantaloupe and maybe that takes off. And this way you don't lose much time.
Good advice from both of you. Let's move on to Daniela on Zoom. Daniela has a question about cucumbers in her garden. I have had mixed success with cucumbers. They've been growing all over the place. Daniela, what's your problem? Go ahead, Daniela.
Can you hear me?
Yes,
Yeah.
Go ahead.
Okay. The problem is that I've got these beetles. They're striped, and I think that they are the cucumber beetles. And I really want to get rid of them because they are also attacking other plants like my pepper plants, and they leave holes. So I read recently that you cannot use neem oil during this time of the year because it's too hot, and it's better to find some other solutions. And I really need to find a solution. So if you can advise, I mean, give me some kind of solution, I would really appreciate. I'm sorry for my English, I'm Italian, but I live in Delaware.
It's fine. It's great English. Elizabeth, what do you suggest?
Sure. So cucumber beetles are a very pesky, annoying insect. I work with them frequently, trying to control them. And I think the best tool for a cucumber beetle is exclusion. So Gary earlier mentioned ag fabric. There's a very lightweight spun woven material called row cover. And row cover it does exactly what it sounds like. You put it over top of your plants and you put it out when you plant and keep that row cover on them with a little bit of give. It lets water through, it lets sunlight through, it lets air through, but it keeps the cucumber beetles out. And that's a great way to just keep them off your little tiny guys, the little tiny plants, and let them grow up, become nice big plants. When they start flowering, you want to take the row cover off because cucumbers do need pollination. And at that point in time, if the cucumber beetles move in, then from a homeowner standpoint, you can try to repel them. They don't like gritty feeling things. So there's some kaolin clay based products that will repel the cucumbers away from your plants, and that's organic. And if you really feel like you want to try to spray them, you can try to use something called Pyganic. It's another organic spray, and it's a little bit more effective than neem.
Gary, you mentioned that you're gardening. I know you're in Maryland, so that would be Zone 7, right?
Right.
Explain to people what the zone system is all about.
So I think North America is the only place that uses the zone system. And because of however you feel about weather changing, the zones are changing. So they're a little bit outdated, but they were kind of set up to help you identify sort of first frost date, last frost date, so that you can kind of plan around it. So knowing when your last frost is in, say, April or so, you can start with your cool weather crops, can take a frost, you know when to start the warm crops, and you know when the frost is coming too. So if you have some longer growing plants, you can time it right. But the zones were to kind of give you an idea of when to plant, what to plant. Now I just recommend, see what the weather's like and see how it goes.
Because, climate change, the zones are changing, right?
Yeah.
We have a Zoom listener wants to know, I heard that fruit grows well when they are planted with native plants. Can you verify that, Elizabeth?
Sure. So I'm going to take a little more nuance with it. I think it's important to remember that many fruits that we grow here are not native plants. Strawberries are native, blueberries are native. There's some brambles and definitely other types of berries that are native. But if we're talking about things like apple trees, they're not from here. I think when you start working with native plants, you get a lot of benefits because you're consciously thinking about the biodiversity and the ecology of your garden. And when you think about biodiversity and ecology, you get all sorts of good benefits like increased pollinators, better habitat for good microbes, increased soil health. And so my sense is that it's probably more of result of the overall gardener's awareness. And that's always a positive thing, to be aware of all the biology and ecology going on out there.
I think we have time for one more question, and this is from a listener in our SciFri VoxPop app with a question about wildfires and garden vegetables. Margaret from Albany, California says, I have quintus beans. I hope I'm saying that correctly. Quintus, Quintus beans, which are like Romano beans. I'm concerned about the wildfires in California with all of the smoke. Are my vegetables, including my beans, going to be okay to eat after all the fires? Gary, what do you think?
Well, I never thought about that, but I would have to roll the dice and say that it's okay. Fires have been around since the Earth's been around, and you know, unless there's a chemical contaminant in your smoke, I think you just go ahead and you grow and you know, harvest as you wish.
Elizabeth?
I'm with Gary. I've not seen anything written on that research wise, but again, I think it's important to take a moment and think about what kind of smoke. Is there likely to be chemical contamination in that, or is it more wild lands? That would
You know, what's interesting is that these are questions we never had to think about before, did we? I mean, wildfires and the smoke spreading everywhere into people's gardens. I mean, climate change has brought around a new reality, Elizabeth. Has it not, about how we have to think about gardening, whether it's the temperature or the zones or the atmosphere?
It absolutely has. And the bulk of my job is working with commercial growers in New York State, and they're having a hard time, and they're professionals. Things are happening like getting 40-degree nights in the beginning of June. And for the rest of you, that's, you know, across the country, that's really cold and really unusual. And everything that is going on climate-wise affects all the gardens too. So it's becoming so much more difficult to just grow. But that shouldn't discourage anyone. I think there's new opportunities that come with that too.
Yeah, we have run out of time. I'm thinking about the gardeners now out in the Pacific Northwest in California with the temperatures and the lack of water that's going on out there. That's a different subject for another time. Right now, we're talking about home gardening, and I want to thank my two expert guests here who have talked about it. Elizabeth Buck, Fresh Market Vegetable Production Specialist with Cornell Cooperative Extension, and Gary Pilarchik, author of the book The Modern Homestead Garden and host of the Rusted Garden YouTube channel. It's a great channel. I suggest you all go over and have a watch there. And if you missed any part of this program and you'd like to hear it again, subscribe to our podcasts, or you can ask your smart speaker to play Science Friday. Say hi to us on social media, Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, or you can email us. The address, SciFri, sciencefriday.com. Send us feedback. Tell us what you'd like us to cover. And thank you all for joining us on this Zoom wonderful interview we had today with our guests. I'm Ira Flato. We'll see you next week.